Welcome to the Power of One. My name is Brian Beery, and I'm your host. This program demonstrates that one person can make a difference. Today, we're very fortunate to have Jamala Taylor with us. Thank you so much for being on the show today. I really appreciate your time and dedication.
Thank you so much for having me. Looking forward to it.
Great. So currently, you're the Reentry Manager for Insight Garden. And we'll talk a little bit about what that program is and how it operates. What we'd like to do is just learn a little bit more about you to get started. So you're from Pasadena, grew up here.
Yes.
What was it like for you growing up in Pasadena?
Yes, I am absolutely born and raised in Pasadena, St. Luke's Hospital. Early 70s, grew up, my teenage years in the 80s. Pasadena was really, really different back then. I don't know if the perception of Pasadena outside of the city was that it was this really wealthy place and everybody here just had tons of money. And, they didn't really know about the projects and all of the things that, were around the projects and the things that were happening and how Pasadena was transforming, as a result of the introduction of crack cocaine and all of those things. So, I grew up right in the midst of it. I actually remember the King's Manors or King Village projects were actually built. Boys Market, Jackie Robinson Center, all of those things.
Yeah, and I think you're right about this perception about Pasadena being this bucolic suburb of Los Angeles.
Yes.
and being a place for very, very, very wealthy people, especially when you think about some of the institutions here. So, but there's so many people who don't have that experience. There's kind of a tale of two cities where there's Pasadena of the wealthy, and then Pasadena of the working class. So maybe could you tell a story a little bit about how you grew up here and some of your experiences here?
Well, my earliest memories were myself, my mom, my sister, my aunt. We lived on the Summit, which was probably the epicenter of, all of the street stuff was going on, like pretty much gang headquarters. It was very, very different. It's probably 5 miles from the Rose Bowl. And the Rose Bowl is like some of the most beautiful property on the planet. And within 5 miles, within the shadow of that, was poverty, extreme poverty. Most people there were, on all of the county and state programs, a lot of single parents. All of the things that went along with that. I remember, hearing gunshots and just all of the stuff that comes along with the inner city. People outside, drinking, smoking, doing what they do, drug dealing. Back at that time, and this was like in the 70s, this was pre-crack. It was angel dust, PCP, and they would have all these documentaries on TV about superhuman strength and all of these things. And, you'd actually see these things or see people flipping out on PCP and all of this. And that wasn't what got the headlines. Pasadena was really known for like the Rose Parade and the Rose Bowl and things like that. But there was an alternative reality to this. And the shadow of that wealth was poverty.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people don't even know today that there are gangs in Pasadena.
Yes.
So how did gangs impact you, and how were they structured when you were a young person?
Well, it was a lot different, especially in the 70s, pre-crack. I think crack was like steroids to gangs.
Yeah.
And on the other side of that, I think crack also introduced the militarization of the police force, not just in Pasadena, but nationally.
Yeah.
If you remember, in those days, they had crack houses, fortified houses. And then like the first law enforcement tool was the Batarang. And that kind of, at least in my mind, marked like the militarization of police force and a different kind of policing on inner city neighborhoods. And I think what it did for gangs was like, it armed them. There was a lot more money. And it became a more attractive lifestyle to people who had only known poverty, quick, fast money. And I think it was just like a steroid to it. It just absolutely exploded, not only in Pasadena, but across the country.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The militarization and then the expansion of gangs occurred simultaneously.
Yep.
So what led you to participate in a gang and then ultimately to be incarcerated?
When you're in the midst of this, you really don't see it as a gang. It's just your reality. When you're surrounded by a thing, it's normalized. It becomes normal. It's not necessarily the labels of gangs, gang members. These are friends and family. And it's just so easy to slide into that when there are not a lot of viable alternatives around you. This is pretty much what you see. And I think in all young people, we want to be accepted. We want to be loved. We want to receive those accolades, especially from older people. And, growing up in a single parent household, I didn't have that male role model, inside the home. And when you don't have something inside the home, you look for it outside the home. So the male role models that I gravitated to were the dudes standing on the corner. So you kind of, get fed that culture. It's kind of seamless. It really is.
What would you, and that's absolutely true with the lack of mentorship, family stress, shall we say, or family pressure. What would you say to young people today who are grappling with some of the same issues? How would you talk to them?
Well, I'm a huge advocate of education. I do think that changes lives. Whatever your circumstance is, education can vastly improve your life, and children you'll one day have improve the trajectory of their lives. So I'm absolutely an advocate of that. But even more than saying it to kids, I would say it to the adults around kids. Expanding the worldview of a child is probably one of the most significant things you can do. When I grew up, my worldview was probably 10 miles from my porch. So all of the things I saw replicated over and over again. I saw no alternative to that. What if my worldview had been expanded? If I had been able to see viable alternatives, people who look like me living differently than me? Because I didn't see a lot of alternatives, it was so normalized. It was just, this is just life. So again, it just kind of reinforced the ability for it to be just a seamless transition into that world.
Yeah, unfortunately in society, there's this notion that people are, not sure how to say this politically correctly, but some people are not good people and other people are good people. To push that a little bit further, what you're talking about is environment. You're talking about how the conditions where someone grows up, where they live and where their family is, that's what really shapes a person. I feel like we're all born good. We're all born with a true spirit and nature. What have you observed over the years?
Never seen an evil baby. Never picked up a baby and saw evil. That's, and I shouldn't even use the word evil because I think that's really rare and really strong. But I think all people are heavily influenced by their environment. You show a person one thing and they're raised in that one thing, they're going to become a reflection of that. I look at my circumstance. I was raised in a single parent household, but I had a great mom and she fought the good fight for me. Every step of the way, I was just drawn to the streets in a way that she couldn't compete with, right? So, you look at my life and you can say, well, maybe he didn't have, a great parent. That's not the case. My parent, in addition to raising somebody who would ultimately go on to prison and spend the majority of his adult life there, also raised my twin who went to college and is a teacher and has a great life in the same household. So, I was kind of lost to the streets at an early age. But my mom, she fought every step of the way. And a single parent, unfortunately, we live in a society that sometimes puts parents in a position where you go out and work and maybe you can't watch over your kids the way you want to because you have to feed those same kids. Or you stay home and you're on government programs and you're not a great example and maybe your kids replicate that piece of it. You know what I mean? And
there's, especially for single parents, there's a huge amount of pressure for them to perform. So it's raising the family, it's earning, the money necessary to be able to pay all the bills.
Yep.
And then it's to make sure kids are going to school and they have enrichment activities. It's a lot of work.
Yep, it is.
So you mentioned that you had been incarcerated.
Yes.
And so let's talk for a minute a little bit about that experience. what was the situation like for you? And
Well, I went to prison at 18 years old. I was released at 49 years old. I was sentenced to serve life in prison. At the time I was sentenced in 1990-ish, life meant life in California. So at 18 years old, my reality is that I was going to die in prison, whether it be by murder or old age. My life was going to end in a concrete box. There'd be no prom, no dating, none of those things. And yeah, that's really heavy for anybody, certainly a teenager. I should have been at home in my room at my mom's house, and instead I'm in a maximum security prison. And in those days, there was no such thing as rehabilitation. Today, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, and they changed their name and added the R. Back then, it was just CDC. They didn't even play at rehabilitation. Prisons were about violence and death and lockdowns, and there were no programs, and it was just a state of being. It wasn't really living.
how did you manage to stay positive during those years? That sounds like decades of isolation.
I didn't stay positive. Somebody, asked me, what were my dreams? I didn't dream. I didn't have dreams. I wasn't, thinking about, well, when I get out or one day. I was literally never getting out, and I understood it. I turned all of my energies into the criminal culture that exists inside of prison. I wanted to be somebody in that world, as most young people do. In that world, that translates to violence and organized crime, all of the things that come along with it. And for maybe 25 of my 31 years, I was deeply rooted in exactly that. So,
would you say that some of that was the result of survival, or feeling as though you needed to defend yourself?
That's part of it. Prison is,
or part of it is the culture too, right?
It is very much entrenched, an entrenched culture, criminal culture inside of prison. But it was also hopelessness.
Yeah.
Imagine being 18, 19, 20 years old and you're literally hopeless. You have no dreams, no hopes beyond rising up the ranks of a criminal enterprise behind walls. You want to be on the highest rung of the ladder inside prison, basically.
Yeah, well, you have no other options and no possibility of a future. I want to ask you a little bit about your what changed inside. But before we do that, since you have firsthand experience with California State Prison System, what are some observations you would make about how we structure incarceration in our state?
Profit and prison should never go hand in hand, and they do. There's something called a prison industrial complex. One of the only places within the United States that slavery is legal is behind bars. I don't know if people really know this. There are industries like prison industrial, PIA, where they have people doing jobs, 8-hour-a-day jobs, maybe making boots or, making clothing or making furniture and then selling those things. And you're compensated, if compensated, 3 cents an hour, 5 cents an hour. Yeah, this is a norm. I think I was in prison in the 90s when they passed all of these laws, 3 strikes and all of the enhancement laws. So they went from you can commit a crime that carries 5 years and then walk out of court with 50 years based on enhancements. And there was a reason for that. They were also in the midst of a prison boom, of a solitary confinement boom. When you spend hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayers' monies to build prisons, you have to fill them. So then you create structures that make sure you have warm bodies in those bunks.
And what you're suggesting as well is that there's incentive for, once you monetize it, there's incentive for those contractors to want to build more prisons, or to remodel them, or to expand them, or to, like you said, dedicate more energy and time and money into those prisons. And if they're not being utilized, then they essentially are a waste of taxpayer dollars.
Absolutely.
So do you feel as though the enhancements of three strikes laws were um, out of, so at that time, what was told to the public is that these were for public safety. These are going to make us safer. Did those laws make us safer?
I don't believe they did make us safer. And you said contractors, not just contractors. I mean, think about the most powerful union in California at that time was the prison guards union.
Yeah.
They don't benefit from prisons closing. They benefit from prisons opening, and they were consistently advocating for exactly that. More prisons mean more staff, means a more powerful union. And it just became kind of cyclical until finally California, thanks to the courts, reached a breaking point and came to understand they couldn't build their way out of all of these new laws, sending all of these people here. Eventually they had to do something, and they would change the laws, youth offender laws, and eventually that's how I would get out, be released from prison.
Yeah, it was AB 109, which led to Prop 47 and Prop 57, and these are changing the legal system, or changing our legal structure so that laws are adjudicated a little bit differently. You were a part of, there was a prison strike.
Yes.
It seems to me that internally as well as externally, a lot of people felt like this is too much. We have too many people incarcerated. The conditions inside are not humane. What was the cause of the strike? When did it occur? And how did it play out?
So the California Department of Corrections in the 80s created a policy called the validation policy. So they have 5 groups that they consider prison-based gangs: the Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, Nus La Familia, and I believe Texas Syndicate. And if they believe you're a member or an associate of one of those groups, you automatically must be housed in solitary confinement. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to have harmed somebody or broken any other rule, then they believe you're a member.
And that's to keep you separate from the other
That
gangs?
is to keep you separate from
your
general
own
population. No. Anybody who is considered to be a member of those groups have to be housed in solitary confinement. So it's just to remove you from general population.
Okay.
They have those particular groups designated as so dangerous they have to be in solitary confinement. So this just became a blanket policy. Basically, if you were, involved in any kind of advocacy or any kind of potential to lead, you would find yourself caught up in that blanket and sent to solitary confinement in Pelican Bay S.H.U. So this went on from the 80s to 2015. And I mean, we tried every legal means you could think of, from the institutional stuff with 602s to the courts. I remember when Pelican Bay first opened, there was a huge lawsuit, Madrid versus Gomez, and everybody was thinking, we're gonna get out, this is gonna win. And at the end of the day, the courts decided, well, yeah, we believe, from a common sense standpoint, that solitary confinement is harmful, but it hasn't been open long enough. So, we haven't seen the effects. So basically,
they weren't able to judge the effects.
They weren't able to judge the effects. So ultimately, once you guys start going crazy in like 10, 11, 12 years, then we'll come back and look at it. And, we went through all of these legal and nothing worked. CDC was not budging. So the hunger strike and the idea really came from, people in solitary have a lot of time on their hands. So we were all, reading and studying the Irish Republican Army and their hunger strike. Mm. And, the purpose of it was not to kill ourselves. It was to draw the eyes of the public to the deepest shadows of CDC, right? Because nobody could see what was going on. The person or the institution that was holding us captive also had the power of the narrative. And the narrative was, hey, these are the worst of the worst. That's why we built this place. And that's all the public knew. So the hunger strike really drew those eyes, kind of pulled that curtain down. And we felt like you couldn't look at what was going on, including the institutional policies that were allowing it, and come to the conclusion that this was fair or just or even legal. So once we drew those eyes and folks started to really see what was going on, it was like, whoa, that might be a bit much.
Oh, yeah. And that's the whole point, is for the public not to be able to turn away, to look away.
Not to be able to turn away.
And it to be so powerful that it captures the public's attention and that there's a focus on it so that then public policy changes. I'm curious about the method for organizing. It would seem like, especially if you're in solitary confinement, how did you communicate with one another? How did you all organize the strike so that you were all in alignment?
It was very, very difficult. Very difficult. Pelican Bay was really, it really was truly solitary. You're in a cell 23 hours a day or 22 and a half hours a day with no window. The yard is inside the pod with you. So you step out of your cell and walk to the back, and the yard is basically another cell with no roof where you could look up. But yeah, so it was very, very difficult. I think CDCR made just a real blunder. They were responding to a 60 Minutes piece that looked into Pelican Bay and folks housed back there, and more CDCR propaganda. These are gang leaders, and they're calling shots in other prisons and all of this. So I don't think CDCR really had a plan to deal with that. So no, we got a plan. We're gonna isolate these guys further. So they created something called what we came to call the short corridor. I believe the official name of it was the Communication Management Unit. And it's 4 buildings inside a solitary. So it ultimately became a whole within a whole. But in doing so, they brought us back together again. Now, we had been spread out over the entire complex, solitary complex, for decades. And it was effective. It was taking its toll. Guys couldn't really communicate with each other. And then they had the great idea to bring us back together. So the history of California prisons is deeply rooted in, a racial component. It's really divided based on race and gang. So a lot of those conversations, and this is the kind of thing, people have been murdered in the name of these groups and this kind of thing for decades. So there was a lot of deep animosity and bitterness. And to go forward with the hunger strike, these things needed to be worked out.
Right. You had to be in alignment, as I said before. You had to be in unison. You had to be unified.
It doesn't work if it's just one segment. It has to be
so how did that
everybody.
Happen?
When they brought folks together, now you have people who hadn't seen each other in decades right next door to each other, who could talk through vents or through cracks in the wall, right? So maybe I'm next door to somebody who's
Aryan Nation,
who's Aryan Brotherhood, right? And maybe there had been death and all of this separating us for all these years. We get to have those conversations. That couldn't have been resolved any other way but for those conversations. So when CDC brought folks back together again, that allowed for those conversations to take place. And it just created building blocks where people were eventually, and don't get me wrong, this was, blacks and whites did not want to work with each other. What person of color is going to want to work with somebody with a swastika on their forehead? Northern and Southern Hispanics had deep history. So it took a lot of work to get to the point to where we could all put those things aside. And the beauty of it is, for the first time in the history of California prisons, we saw unity pay dividends, unity of purpose. And that led to the end of hostilities agreement. California prison system is very, very different than what it was when I came into it. Racial violence ruled the day. Today, very little racial violence. There's still violence here and there, but nowhere near on the level of, say, the 90s.
And you would say the turning point was the hunger strike?
Without question. The end of hostilities agreement that grew out of the hunger strike was a turning point.
That's fascinating. That's amazing. Mm-hmm. Let's talk for a few minutes about your own personal transformation. So there's a hunger strike. Then what happened to you to start to move you in a different direction?
Okay, so the hunger strike ended with the administration agreeing to completely change the policy in a way that resulted in most of us, being released back to general population. So I was ultimately released. They came to the decision, the hunger strike ended in 2013. So it took about 2 years for us to actually get out. So I actually served from 2000 to 2015. And then, they just basically started clearing it out, putting us all over the system. And when I got out, it turns out that some of the laws had changed. They were the youth offender laws, SB 260 and 261, which state that if you committed your crime first before you were 18 and then second before you were 26, that you could at least go to board and make the case that you had been rehabilitated. Whereas, previously, you couldn't do that. If you had life, my earliest possible parole date was 2053, prior to those laws changing. And we were so intent in solitary on getting out, most of us didn't even know about those laws. They just didn't apply to us. So I was greeted with that. And that was, the impetus to really try something different. They wanted you to take all of these classes. Prison had completely changed. They had nonprofits in there and free people, and maximum security prisons prior to me going to solitary, there was
no programs.
No programs. So this was completely foreign to me. But now there's hope. Remember, at that point I'd been in for say 25 years and with no hope, and now all of a sudden there was a little bit of hope. So that was my impetus.
So then you started studying. What did you study, and did you earn a degree while you were incarcerated?
Solitary was turned into like college, so I was studying the whole time. Everybody was. You meet somebody from solitary, they're usually very well read and articulate and all of that. We spent our time improving on ourselves. It actually, kind of became university. But when I got out, they had self-help classes. So the first class I signed up for, and really quickly, the first week I was out, I can recall being in my cell with the lights turned out. I was overwhelmed. In solitary, it's deathly quiet. In the general population, there's noise, yelling, screaming, keys, phones, loudspeaker. You don't have any of that. So I had kind of devolved in terms of socialization from being in solitary for so long. And, I remember being out in the day room, back against the wall, these people moving around. I saw a sign-up sheet on the board for a program called Insight Garden Program. So put the Insight and program to the side. I just saw garden. I've been surrounded by metal and concrete for 15 years.
And you were thinking, I want some green.
I want to touch something.
Yes.
Signed up. Best thing I ever did. To this day, it has positive ramifications in my life. And that class allowed me to kind of reconnect to nature and center myself. And it opened the door for me to be able to do the work in other classes that I needed to do with drug addiction, with anger, with my relationship to gangs and crime. So, yeah.
Yeah, so we just have a few seconds left. Can you describe what you do now and how Insight Gardens has created a pathway for you?
So I'm the Reentry Manager for the Insight Garden Program. We work inside 9 prisons across the state, including both women's prisons. We have an environmental curriculum broken down into 4 arcs. When our participants are released, we provide reentry services for them, starting with a gate pickup, a cell phone. We help folks get connected to jobs, to higher education. We have a peer mentorship model. Most of the people on the reentry side are formerly incarcerated, so there's a similarity. We can operate in those gray spaces. We connect to nature. We teach nature on the inside and connect to nature on the outside.
And where can people find more information about Insight Gardens?
InsightGardenProgram.org.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us today. There's so much more I wanted to ask, but we've run out of time. So thank you very much, Jamala.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.